My guest this evening is Jessica Hoppe. Jessica is a Honduran Ecuadorian writer and the creator of at Nueva Yorka on Instagram. She's been featured on ABC News. Her work has appeared in the Latino Book Review in the New York Times, Vogue, and elsewhere. She was a board member of Time of Butterflies, a nonprofit supporting families through domestic abuse recovery, and is an organizer with the Santam and Ismin Writers Group. She lives in New York City. Jessica's memoir, First in the Family, A Story of Survival, Recovery, and the American Dream, was published in September. Carl Erik Fisher, a former guest on this program, wrote about Jessica's book, quote, First in the Family sings with love and shouts with rage, offering an uplifting document of resilience and recovery, even while calling out the seductive dangers of the American dream. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful introduction using Carl's quote. It is my favorite one. I really love that.
Um, it's through Carl that I first became aware of you when we were both at this Flourishing After Recovery workshop. Um,
Yes, yes, wonderful
how
day.
did you first? I read about his book and just sent him an email and said, "Hey, you want to be on my show?" And he graciously responded. I'm curious how you came across him.
Yes, well, I loved his book, The Urge, and I used it extensively in my own research. It really just broadened the aperture of my understanding. Historically, I love history, and I got so much out of it, particularly the history of AA and its founders and its relationship uh, in sort of being proliferated around the world and how that occurred. I thought that was fascinating, and his personal story as well. I I was able to attend a panel at Columbia here in New York, where I live. And I once again was able to hear him in conversation leading a panel. And I did what I sort of have done throughout my career, which is just to ask him to sign my book and tell him how much I appreciated his work. And from there, we've been in touch. I love his newsletter and all of his offerings. I love the pedagogy, the lens of his work in thinking about recovery as flourishing and how I relate to that. It's been really, really insightful and helpful to me in my recovery. So I'm very grateful for his work.
Yeah, I find it a seminal piece. I refer to it
Likewise.
all the time.
Hmm.
Actually, and that's one of the things that impresses me about your book. Uh, like his and like work by Maya Solovitz, all three of you talk about your recovery, but you talk about it in the context of history.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for mentioning Maya. I love her as well. Oh, I'm so happy to be named in that group. Yes, thank you. That's
No,
that's a
and
high
there's
compliment.
she's been a guest on this show, and then I'll show off, and then I'll shut up.
No, please
Another
continue.
guest who you also mention in your book is Sheila Vicaria.
Mhm. Love her. Great work as well. Loved her book, Harm
Yeah.
Reduction. Fantastic. And the work at the Drug Policy Alliance, really, really important.
Let's get down to it. How do you What about you as a writer? Give us some history of you as a writer. I know a little bit. I know about the beginning. I know when you were in grade school and having to hold a pencil properly. Might not have been
Yes.
the beginning, but it might have been the first obstacle you had to overcome. Who knows?
I do. Yeah, I do see it as the beginning. I really do because I was always very creative. I was always just very, very curious about people and how they communicated with each other and how we interacted with each other, how we loved each other. So, my first, I think, yeah, my writing began with just sort of observing my family. And I grew up in a bilingual home. And so the language that was used was often like very much interchanged. And Spanglish is a very vibrant and alive sort of way of communicating. And I loved particularly how well, both my parents really used the language and used words. I think one of my favorite parts of my book is sort of dissecting, looking at the etymology and then the deeper meaning, the clinical significance and historical relevance of my mom's use of this word desalmado, which means sort of separated from one's soul. So alma means soul, and this suggested that she was using it to refer to my grandfather, her father, as a soulless person. And I just, I felt that I could not recall her using that word up until that point. And I was a couple years into my sobriety and a grown woman by that time. And all of my life, I couldn't recall another time that she'd used it. And I just became so fascinated by that and thinking about it within the context of recovery and sort of some of the mythological stories behind the power of alcohol, the power of drugs to sort of, inhabit our bodies and animate something hidden deep within us that maybe in our conscious life we're not able to access, or that we're, in my case, suppressing. So yeah, I think it started as a very young child, writing and thinking and contemplating these things, observing. I was always very observant, and I think that is definitely the germ, the beginning there of that. But I did, as you said, thank you for reading the book so carefully and so thoughtfully. As a young child, I did show signs early on of dyslexia and ADHD, which definitely came from me like a vengeance while writing this book. And that is very common for people who also suffer from substance use disorder. Well, I just got back from my book tour, and so I sign a lot of books, and I have to ask for people's names and spell them correctly. And so I noticed my dyslexia popping up once again, which is making me a little self-conscious. So I sort of words, letters sort of scramble, and when I'm trying very hard to write or, do things quickly as you do, when you have a line of people waiting, I'll begin say I'm writing the name Jessica, and it'll begin with like SSICA, and I'll go back to the beginning and write the J and the E, or just write the J. It's interesting how that, the scramble from the mind to the hand to the, those messages, those neural pathways were just very, very triggered by like my emotional state, my ability to regulate my nervous system, and also trauma is a really big component. I found in my research that is related to dyslexia, ADHD, and I've related to that research. I found that very important, in addressing um, my neurodivergence and working with my brain as opposed to being very harsh and judgmental of what I felt was not operating, quote, normally. And so embracing that, even if it's taken me, to this time now, I'm in my 40s, I'm going to be 42 on November 5th. Um, I appreciate that I've been able to go back to that time and recover that little girl, redeem her in some way, understand her more, and just be very proud of what we've achieved.
Well, I've experienced dyslexia, not mine, but with family members, and
Yeah.
certainly my son, who we lost to addiction, had
Yes. Sorry.
ADHD, and
Mm,
that the number of times when I talk to people about their addiction and ADHD comes up is a lot.
yeah, it's very high. Yeah, it's difficult. And I think, my book moves into the pressures of the American dream and sort of the models of achievement and high achievement and achievement, as being representative of your value and your worth. In society, in families, and even in us, in ourselves personally. We've internalized a lot of ideas, at least for me, I will speak for myself. And especially as the daughter of Honduran and Ecuadorian immigrants, it really was very much, I was very aware of that pressure, that there were opportunities that were withheld, that my parents were marginalized, and there was quite a bit of oppression and discrimination, and I was going to sort of right those wrongs, and I was going to have the opportunity through their sacrifices to be able to do that. And that it was something I realized as an adult, of course, that was a pain that I could not heal. Those were wounds that were not my fault, and therefore they couldn't ever be my responsibility. Although I really wanted the opportunity to have my parents understand that and have our relationship grow more deeply through understanding that, sort of removing the internalized stigmas and the internalized pressure, and sort of have a way of loving ourselves based on, what we believe and feel, and love each other, from that perspective as well, as opposed to the things that we've internalized.
Let me go back a little bit. Two things. The school system, believe it or
Mm.
not, where I grew up in New Jersey was just down the road from Mendham.
Amazing.
Yeah. Bernardsville, but really on the order. I have to tell you, I Googled One Union Schoolhouse Road the other night because I could have driven there easily.
I'm sure you did. You probably took that road.
Yeah.
Union Square Road, yeah, off of Roxitticus. I'm sure you did.
Yes. And we don't have to do this on air, but I can tell you stories about Roxitticus. I know stories about the origin of Roxitticus to the golf course and stuff.
Oh, wow. Yes, we'll do that offline. I'd love to hear it.
Um, how sophisticated when you were dealing with dyslexia, how sophisticated was the school system in helping you out in any way?
They were quite sophisticated. It was a matter of, I think the thing was at Mendham, it was very well known. Like Mendham is an affluent area, and therefore the public schools were, quite similar to a private school. Very small classes. People there were high expectations, and I when my teacher, spoke to, as I read about in my book, spoke to my mother, my father in particular was reticent, and he was afraid. He didn't want me to be labeled, and he didn't want me to be put sort of, in a remedial course, or that hold me back in any way. And so what I read about is, yeah, exactly. What I read about is that, I don't blame him for that at all. That makes a lot of sense to me, like looking at it from his perspective. um, However, it was that the poison of that narrative, right? That would not allow him to get the assistance that he needed, and now I would have the same fate, because of this marginalization that occurs. I will say too, I needed assistance that many of the students that I went to school with did not need. And so therefore it wasn't very obvious to teachers and administrators, um, that they would need to provide that, and there wasn't a lot of desire to provide that for me. Things like, um, financial aid and, programs that could have, looking up scholarships and things like that, which would have been so helpful. They just weren't in place because these weren't things that a lot of the students needed, or if they did, I wasn't aware of them. I was aware of the affluence that surrounded me, the opportunity therein. And I thought I needed to just keep up with the Joneses, and that really was my parents' perspective as well. We were doing the best we could to keep up. And the idea was, get to college. And that was going to be, the leap from one generation to the next. And it would be secured in getting a college degree.
When you say from one generation to the next, any thoughts whether anybody else in your family, whether there was dyslexia in prior generations?
Absolutely. When I talk to my family now, I'm like, do you know what this is right now? Like, even in this conversation, it's evident, of my mother, my father, that often like just like jump from one, conversation to the next, and then, all of a sudden it's turned and it's a totally different topic, or we're not entirely conversing. It's sort of like I'm saying one thing, and we're not getting that ping pong back. It's not like the rally in tennis. It's like, it's like just gone the other way and totally diverted. So I love
And, oh, sorry,
just getting out.
sorry to interrupt, it just made me think, you said when your mother, she always uses verbs in the past tense.
Yes, I love that. Yes, it's I say it's a quirk in her bilingualism. And especially when she's typing in text messages, it's really evident. And I just love her way of communicating. I think it's really beautiful. And I certainly don't know Spanish the way she knows how to speak English. So it's certainly not anything that I judge. I just love how the brain works. And but yes, there's a long history of neurodivergence in my family. Also, a lot of mental illness, schizophrenia. We also have epilepsy. I mean, you name it. It's there. It's just that we didn't have the language to discuss what was, ailing us. It was just sort of it was used in different language, sort of like locura, or it was just a way of sort of contextualizing things and making them more broad. And also what I discovered a lot about that is not a matter of ignorance or not understanding. It is literally a withholding, which is part of the American project. And um it's just to avoid the the very real and damaging consequences of having stigma apply to you or your family. So if it was known that if we did sort of own that we were suffering from a certain disorder, we could be very easily labeled, and that could make us a target. So that was something that understanding, I wasn't so much blaming my family of God, why didn't we know this? Why didn't we have this information? And that is how I felt in the initial days of my recovery, in the initial months and, years. And then I started to learn more about how people of color are treated, and how the war on drugs and the racialization and criminalization of drug use really, really affected my family story and my ability to recover.
Well, when you describe in the book, some of the ways your father was treated at work,
Mm.
that would be enough to make me keep my mouth shut.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for saying that. That's right. I definitely observed him, and to use the language of recovery, I wanted an easier, softer way. And my father really was of that mind. He really wanted to keep his head down and just sort of, keep working, and he could withstand anything, and he was going to provide for the family. My mother and my sisters were more, vocal advocates. And I saw that the result was the same on both ends. We were not winning or being heard as by using our voices, by raising our voices. It was the same result. And so I felt very discouraged by that, very saddened by that. And so I felt that it would be an easier, softer way to keep my mouth shut and sort of try and quote play by the rules, and see where that would land me. Because the message is that if you do that and play by the rules, if you work hard enough, you can be anything you want to be, right? So um waking up to the myth of that American story, the American dream, um, was a deep awakening. It was a necessary component of my recovery, because it allowed me to relieve the shame that I'd felt about who I am and who my family is.
Um, Let me go back. I'm hooked on this. I mean, did you, as a youngster in grade school, middle school, high school, did you keep a journal? Did you write a lot?
Sometimes, my mother had some of our childhood photos and things, personal items in a storage facility, and she recently went into it to recover what was there. We all had no idea really what she would find, and she found this portrait that I painted my freshman year of high school. And if I do say so myself, it's quite good. And yeah, to find those remnants, she also found this storybook project that I wrote about myself and my family and how much I loved school. I did write, writing a diary would be quite dangerous because my mom was very strict and she was pretty nosy. So she, if she found something like a diary, she would take care of it. Maybe not my father, but my mother for sure. So you probably didn't want written evidence. But certainly I did write, I did do sort of have a practice very much like morning pages. Um, uh, High school and school was quite painful for me. I have to be honest. So I did refer, to fantasy, to having a life inside my imagination. I was very close with my sisters. Yeah, it was a difficult time for me, but I did remain very creative, and I had a whole world inside my mind, an idea, a fantasy very much taken from my parents that all would be well once I was able to get out of this small town that didn't very much accept me or see me for who I was. But turns out that's a myth too. um, so yeah, I needed to find that peace and that sense of home within myself. But that is a long journey for most people. So I do bring some grace to that as
When did you begin your memoir? What are the book's origins?
well. Well, I was trying to be a writer for quite some time. I was trying to get published a lot. I think the way that it's described as being a writer, a published author through non traditional pathways, meaning I don't have an MFA. I do live in New York City, which is a great privilege, particularly when it comes to publishing, because it is widely known as sort of the center of publishing in many ways, because a lot of the houses are here and many writers live here. Therefore, there are a lot of readings and there are a lot of workshops and events where one could listen to publishing experts, writers themselves. And so I sort of got to work learning about the industry that way. Um, After college, I got an internship in fashion working for Ralph Lauren. And after the economic the economic crash in 2008, um, I think fashion is very notoriously like all of the creative, like publishing too. Very low paying, and so I wasn't able to sustain my career in fashion. And I didn't know. I also felt in fashion, I had an idea of it being sort of a dream job. And when I entered, I realized that it was very unfulfilling to me in many ways. But I felt I had made such a sacrifice financially, emotionally, spiritually to get that job that I wasn't entitled to leave it or to change course. I didn't know how to change course. And then, of course, life pushed me out and I was forced to leave that job. I wasn't making it financially. So that really put me in a position to ask myself what I wanted. And I was writing again privately on a blog. And these things were kind of popular in that time. They still are, right? It's more about social media. And so I I was writing, and that was a way of practicing every day writing. And then I was like, well, I want to be published, so I'd go into some workshops to learn how people do that, to learn who the editors, who the gatekeepers were in that realm. And I did. I started writing. Oftentimes, I would have to wait until times like now, like Hispanic Heritage Month, to have anyone consider my story at all. So I started building a platform on social media. It's called Nueva Yorka, which you read in my bio. And I just wanted a place to sort of share my thoughts, share my creativity, self expression without having to ask permission. And that built out, a nice audience, and people started following my story, but it was still very much, um, it was very particularly curated. It's very much about being, a New York girl who has it all together. And meanwhile, my substance use disorder was escalating very quickly and very seriously. And so it was my social media where I decided to be honest about myself. And then that opened a whole new pathway for my writing and for my platform as well. Some people really liked it, other people defected, and that was fine. But making that hard turn has been tricky. But I find that the people who are really deeply engaged in my story really appreciated the honesty in my sharing that I had been in recovery and that I wanted to be honest about that, and I wanted to be helpful in destigmatizing the disorder.
Let's talk about your story a little more.
Mhm.
When I read the book, the first time through, the first imagery that came to me was um, Russian dolls, one tucked inside the other.
Oh,
So
cool.
it's your story, and then there's the family story, and then the larger social story. And and then
Right.
I went to a different metaphor, which is it seems to me the structure of the book was a little bit like you had a zoom lens, and you started from the outside. You watched from far away, closed into your family, closed into yourself, and then once you started dealing with yourself in recovery, you opened back up to the family, and then ultimately back to the world at large, and
Mhm.
helping to change things.
That's lovely. Yes, exactly. Thank you. You get it. You're on the money, Bill.
Um, was that structure intentional? Or because it's in your introduction, you talk about, well, these are some you make it sound like everything is haphazard. This I'm gonna write about this, and then I'll write about that, and I don't think it's as quite as haphazard as your introduction makes it sound.
You. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I didn't think so, but some of the feedback was that it was a bit fragmented, and I think certainly in some parts, yes, particularly in sort of my coming into awareness about my substance use disorder, right, and some of the childhood memories, which it can be difficult to reach back that far into your childhood, and of course. Memory is your perspective, and so it can't be it can't be retold with 100% accuracy by, everyone's, perspective. So, I did the very best that I could. And, but my mission, yes, from the beginning was to tell this meta story and to use my personal history and my family's in order to contextualize that for people. Because oftentimes when you try and make, um, a statement or you have a thesis that might sound, you know, like it might sound sort of conceptual, which is that I'm saying I'm using my book to interrogate the American dream as the ultimate gateway drug. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I mean that I wanted to get to the root of what was ailing my family, the illness, and that was pain. And what was that pain being passed down? It was more than bad actors. It was more than, you know, these few people who were addicts were bad guys, you know what I mean? They're bad people. And so we should just stay away from them in the family or we should sweep that under the rug and never talk about it and just try and be, the quote good people and the good citizens aren't, the mono minority. That wasn't going to work. Everyone in our family had a story and had a story well beyond what was being shared and passed down. I wanted to get to the truth of that, to the root of it. And that was extremely relevant to me personally. And I felt that it could be sort of a blueprint for understanding, like I read in the book, just as you must understand how a drug operates within your body, so too must you understand how systems of domination are at work in your life. So, how had white supremacy affected me throughout my life? How had misogyny, poured its way into our family and making life sort of unlivable, conditions unlivable, and very dangerous for many of the women, for any of the queer people in my family. These were things that needed to be eradicated, but we had to be in a place where we could be honest, where we could have the language in order to name something, because you can't deal with something if you can't name it, if it doesn't take a realistic sort of life form. And so I set about to name some of these things, and this was very triggering for my family. It was very upsetting, you know. The loss of our house, naming that as enduring a period of housing insecurity, a period of homelessness was very upsetting to my mother. But I did ask her, gently, what would you call it? And she didn't have an answer. There wasn't an easier, softer way. But acknowledging that that was what occurred and that that was no fault of her own or my father's, it really was a healing balm. It was just a relief, I think, because there's such a weighted pressure of feeling as if some of the things that occurred that were a result of oppression or racism or, you know, and our social structures, you take that upon yourself. And that's incredibly shameful to be relieved of that and to understand how the system works. And to know that your basic needs are human needs and they should be provided for. And if you are working, your tail off,
Yeah.
you should be able to have enough to live and provide for your family. And not having those things is incredibly toxic, and believing that you're at fault for that is also toxic. And so it makes a lot of sense that a lot of people were like me, that the coping mechanism manifested in substance use disorder, that it didn't manifest in that same exact way for the other people in my immediate family, really illustrated the stigma, the particular stigma attached to substance use disorder. And what I wanted was to bring us all sort of shoulder to shoulder and not make addiction such, this like vilified separate thing, to bring it in and understand this is a part of our family history. These are the reasons why, and this is how we sort of turn the page and talk about this realistically. And as I've said before, I wasn't so interested in getting the compassion of my family because compassion will only take you so far, if anywhere at all. I wanted them to be acquainted with the facts, with the reality, because that was so much more liberating for me and also for them.
I At the introduction, I meant to say something. I'm going to just read a little
Mm,
bit now because I
great.
think it relates to what you just said. Um,
Mhm.
I can't help but recognize the irony that this discussion is between a young woman of color in long term recovery from substance use and a 78-year-old white male who happens to be named Bill W.
That's right.
I, I say this not to create tension, rather as evidence that, as you write, Jessica, we become healers just by telling our stories.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yes.
and I have my faith. I was a theater teacher for a long time, and a director, so
Oh.
my faith in storytelling and the
Mm,
power of story is great,
mm,
which is one reason why I appreciate your book so much because you tell so many stories, or
mm.
so many stories that become the story told so
Yeah.
well.
Oh, thank you so much. That means the world to me, Bill. I really appreciate you saying that because I think that a lot of there has been some resistance to the story, in that it not be the universal story, because we know that in our culture we've designed the universal story to be you, right? I've read many books on this topic that were written by people who identify as you do, and I've been able to relate to the feeling. I have always been aware that, well, that would not work out for me that way. That would have not been the ends that I met. Or I definitely wouldn't have been able to, be given that opportunity. So when you look at the history of the narration of recovery, right, what becomes evident is that people of color are not very often entitled to tell the story of their recovery or to narrate substance use disorder, but they are often employed to be the image of um, drug dealing, drug using, the awful effects, the consequence of it, which are incarceration, deportation, death. These are all the stories in my family. I know, sadly, you've experienced some of those tragic consequences as well in your family. So it's not that it doesn't happen to all of us. It's about the prevalence and the very strategic design of the government to racialize certain drugs. For example, cannabis as marijuana, cocaine ghettoized as crack, and to that end, incarcerate, um, black and brown men in particular, black and brown people, pardon me. So uh, that had a tremendous effect on my family, in the fact that we were not able to look at this with the clarity we were all very much influenced by that narrative, by that stigma, and staying as far away from it as possible and not being associated with the consequences and God forbid, not falling, subject to them, prey to them. So it was very difficult, but it really opened up such a door to healing and a recovery as a family for my parents to be confronted with that label, of being an addict and the image that they had of their perfect daughter and their baby, And so it really was useful for me to confront the lie of those labels and the lie of those stories. Because in, in coming into a consciousness and awareness of how substance use disorder was operating within my life and what it would take for me to recover, they, inevitably had to, look out and see the world and see the messages that we'd all been internalizing since the 80s and 90s, the height of the war on drugs propaganda. I was raised with the, just say no and the fried egg on the cast iron pan, things like this are very much simplified something that was being made to target and kill and incarcerate, my people in my community, people in my family. So it is very nuanced. And I do want to look at how things are different for someone like you and like me. But I also wanted to illuminate the ideas that we can all benefit from this knowledge, which is something that I think Carl does really well too. We can all benefit from this knowledge and understanding it, right? So it's not to take away anyone's experience or to erase the history of Bill and Bob, is to say, hey, this began so many years before Bill and Bob, and it's still alive today. And they were influenced by it. And it doesn't I don't think it would take away anything from Bill or Bob to acknowledge or to say the recovery history begins 200 years before Bill and Bob. And it was an indigenous practice. It was a network of indigenous recovery healers. And the central one I write about being Handsome Lake, who invented this practice of the wounded healer, which is to tell your story. And the practice of the sobriety circle, which is group therapy, right? And we know, there's, I think we've all been desperate for a solution, a cure. And the only thing that we do know is that there's a constellation of factors that have to kind of intersect in a person for substance use disorder to manifest. It's sort of unknowable, and it's very, it's very much based on the individual, and therefore what it will take for them to recover is an individual process. However, the one thing that benefits everyone is social network. And the way that has been implemented is through group therapy, that powerful moment of identification, that little spark of truth that jumps from one person to the next. And I've had that feeling with you, with Leslie Jameson, with Carl, with my partner, with my mother, with my niece and nephew, and that's a universal experience. It's a very human experience. And what makes that even more profound and deeper is to acknowledge, hey, I can see how this would be different for you. I acknowledge that, and I want to be part of what makes this place safer for you and for me. And that, there just be an equitable pathway for all of our recovery, for our collective recovery. So just as I went through that process with my family, where it's like, I can't get this like diagnosis and go in the corner and come back the perfect daughter again. I'm going to need your help. I'm going to need your participation. And likewise, that's what I did with my group. I needed it to be acknowledged that I was having a different experience, that I was very much affected by what was going on in the world. I couldn't pretend as if, crossing the threshold into an AA meeting was, a portal to some kind of post-racial utopia. I had to bring all of it with me. There couldn't be any quote outside issue. And that was something that we could all benefit from and grow from as a group and as people invested in community and recovering communally. And that was something, that was not an easy process. But once I began to write about it, I found so much support. So I really appreciate you being one of those people. It means the world to me. And I know that you reach, many people. So, hopefully, um, that message can go round and round, because it's not about erasing anything or taking anything away. It's about enhancing and expanding our understanding of how long this medicine has been alive and with it, with us, and really dismantling this idea of substance use disorder as a moral failure. Because historically, fatal drug use rises with economic depression, war, great societal pain, such as, for example, right now we're experiencing it on a universal level worldwide. There's a deep pain and a fear for the future. So it makes sense that people will seek something to address that pain, because the systems that we have in place, such as our government, are not addressing them. And there's no better example or more clear example than when it comes to substance use disorder, because we could be doing so much to eradicate this. And they do not.
Uh, there I've had the thought lately, and I've been exploring it, the notion that you can take almost any event in history, and there is a corollary, a drug use or abuse corollary to the event. I just
Yes.
wrote a piece recently about Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed? Well, it turns out the apples he planted were all used to make apple cider, hard cider. They
Oh.
weren't used for they weren't the apples that we eat today. They required grafting, they required something different. He was on the
Mhm.
western frontier, he was a businessman, he could get land. If he planted enough apples, they could get used for cider, and that was at a time when America was drinking, hard cider, rum, beer, and wine.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. It was more water, right? That was the
Yes,
that was the drink that was consumed the most. Yeah, more than water.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
So, um, I
Incredible. I know.
I don't know whether I this occurred to me because I read your book, or I'd like to think it was my own idea,
Sure.
but then in reading the book, after I had this idea, um, there was the notion that when you were in there was a point when you were in AA, when you were in a cocoon, or
Yeah.
the anonymity keeps people in a cocoon. There's a privacy that people kinda wrap themselves in, and
Mhm.
actually, you wrote, "But admitting my flaw in a cocoon of shared identity gave me the deepest sense of belonging I had experienced." But then you started to question what was going on in that cocoon, and in
Mhm.
my mind, that's when you became a butterfly.
Oh, thank you.
And here's so I looked up butterfly just to look it up. The
Mhm.
spiritual meaning of the butterfly encompasses transformation, rebirth, and personal growth. It represents the journey of self discovery and the ability to change and evolve. Butterflies symbolize freedom, lightness, and joy, reminding us to let go of burdens and embrace a sense of liberation.
Oh, wow, I love
Isn't that
that.
cool? And that's just Googling it.
Yeah.
That's pretty
Yeah.
cool. And it seems to me, in a certain way, it describes the best of what your book sets out to accomplish.
Mm. Thank you so much. That's beautiful. I love that you see it that way. I really hope that many more people have your perspective, Bill. That's very profound and insightful and loving, actually. I think that when I was learning, I was going to some of these workshops. One of the teachers said, it's hard enough to come to the page. So come to the page, imagining someone who's there to willingly understand, not willfully disagree. And I know that, recovery is precious to so many people. And I relate to that. It's precious to me. The reason anonymity was, so sacred was because In my substance use disorder, I really was just I was very sacrificial. I just would give away. I give myself away, and I trusted people who shouldn't be trusted or didn't earn my trust, rather. And that led to a lot of pain. So rebuilding that, rebuilding my selfhood and therefore my integrity, and then the courage to allow that to be seen, even if someone was going to disagree with me, or if they were going to willfully disagree, adamantly disagree, which some people do. But I think that they misunderstand my intention, and so I'm so glad that you have understood the full intention of my work, which is liberation for all of us. And so, if an idea, if a notion is oppressive to me, it's oppressive to you. And I think that we can all hope that we're people who don't see color, which is what I was told a lot, or we're all the same and things like that. And I think the core of our essence of our humanity, sure, we have similarities, but unfortunately we can't ignore the world that has been erected around us, and the very powerful forces that influence the way I'm going to move through it and the way you're going to move through it. And so we all do each other a service to acknowledge that and to just be aware of it enough. You know, I I just find my position in that spectrum, I identify where I hold privileges, and therefore where I need to be of service. And I identify where, I'm under, some powerful forces, I'm facing some challenges, and therefore I could use some help. And, we're in that exchange now. You've offered me your platform. You've given me such, a deep and thorough review of my work, and you're elevating it. And so we're in this practice together now, and you're offering me the space to say, to share my message, like I said, with your platform. And that's a huge, that is the principle behind sort of acknowledging that we want to be together. We're not necessarily the same, but we're going to be in community together. And so I just want, perhaps like these difficult conversations. For example, I had that with my family. I had that, with my A group. I consistently have that, moving forward, talking about the book. But there's so much growth potential in that friction, right? And conflict is not, a negative thing. We're human beings, we're going to disagree. We're going to come from different perspectives, perhaps. But part of one of the gifts of recovery is to be able to stay in that sort of rub of discomfort and move through to the other side, which is consciousness, which is awakening. And in that consciousness, we can have a conversation like the one that you and me are having right now. And so that's what I hope can occur with my reader, or someone who comes to the page and maybe finds a moment of discomfort, that they can just stay with me and sort of embrace, the meta story, which is one, like I said, that is liberation for us all, that we all be butterflies, right?
Yes. Yes, I like that.
Hmm.
It took me to the butterfly exhibit at the Museum of Natural History.
Oh, yes, I took my niece there. She loved it, and my mother too.
It's beautiful.
It was stunning, and they're just flying all around, and they're like the tiniest ones in like muted soft colors, and then they're the most vibrant ones. You can't even imagine that it's a butterfly, but yeah, it's very, as we say in Spanish, impresionante.
Um, you were in you were seeing a therapist, I believe you said, for 10 years before you said, "I'm an alcoholic." Um,
Yeah.
how did you how did you get away with it for 10 years? And
I was very
do I hang
right,
that on you
little
do I hang that on you or your therapist?
no, no. I think, no, I was aware. I was speaking to my therapist about what was happening in my life, but like I say in my book, there was always something to distract from the root, the one constant in all of those scenarios, right? Which was the substance that was really animating the pain that I was suppressing. And so, I was involved in a terrible relationship that I clearly needed to extricate myself from. I couldn't make enough money. I couldn't hold on to a job, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever kind of incident was happening, or instability, that was my problem, and if I could just solve or find a solution for that, then I wouldn't need to use drugs. I wouldn't need to drink the way I was drinking. I wouldn't be so upset, So that was the thinking, and that is a very common way of looking at using substances as self-medication or escapism or numbing out, or all the various reasons that we use drugs. Um, I was particularly afraid, or the consequences of my drug use would come a little more quickly when I was using cocaine. And so I was very forthcoming, not very, no, that's a lie too. I began because was getting so afraid. I began to share that with my therapist, and we would walk through that. And I stopped using cocaine, sort of on my own. And so then I think that really put, the gas on my drinking. And I saw using cocaine and using alcohol as different. And when we know that they're both drugs, and alcohol is a very powerful drug, and it's ubiquitous, and it's so socially acceptable, drink responsibly as a slogan was created for a reason, right? To make you believe that this is sort of an innocuous substance. And it is my belief that there are purposes for drugs, particularly with ceremony, and there are ways, to use these very powerful substances. But the world that we live in, and the ways that these drugs have been deregulated, they can be very, very dangerous. So the way I was using cocaine was very dangerous, and I didn't want to die. But I didn't see my drinking as being as dangerous. And I think that was a severe miscalculation on my part. But like I say, I don't blame myself, because that is the social, that is the message, that is the cultural understanding of drinking. So I did come to a point where I had a near death experience, and that's when I talked to my therapist about it. And we had a very, very close relationship, and she was like family to me. And so I think that she didn't really want to tell me any harsh news, or, she was very gentle. And frankly, I really needed that. And that's why our relationship continued for so long. She was a safe space for me. She was loving kindness. And the message came to me as it should, which was that a stranger saved my life. And I think that was probably, the only conditions, at least where I was in that state, that could have gotten through to me, because I just felt very judged by anyone else who would sort of make an assessment of, my drinking or my drug use. And hers was completely neutral. There was no reason for her to, step up and save my life that day. But she did, and she was concerned enough to try to go through the effort of, searching for me and making sure that that I was safe. And what she told me changed my life. In particular, the question she asked me, which was, "Do you know what's happening to you?" Which really reframed, gave me a new orientation for how I was feeling about myself, and about the, cycle of demoralizing behavior that I was involved in, and how alcohol was operating within that cycle, and sort of, perpetuating it over and over again. And I couldn't interrupt it. And the only way I was going to be able to interrupt it was to remove the substance. So, and that's the reason I choose abstinence. So I don't measure my sobriety by the time of my abstinence. It's a choice that I make every single day, because I'm still curious about where that journey will take me. But once again, it's not the measure of my self-worth or the qualification for me as a person in recovery. Um, it's just me, using my agency, which is such an important part of my recovery too, to know that I can make the right decisions for myself, that I didn't need to be questioned. I didn't need to be infantilized or, not believed. And so that was a huge growth for me. But I don't blame my therapist at all. I thank her. She saved my life in many ways, over and over again. And she was honest with me that day. And she did tell me to try an 8-day meeting and see how it feels. She was very gentle. She knew that what that would mean to me, and how difficult it would be to remove alcohol, how dependent I'd become, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. I really removing alcohol was just the most, dire. It was a death. It was a small death,
Yes, I think
for
so.
me.
Yes. You mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy. Was that with the same therapist or somebody else?
Yeah, yeah. We did move through cognitive behavioral therapy. I also wanted hypnotherapy, but she felt like that would be a little triggering for
Right.
me. It's still something I think about, but I do come back to what she advised about it. That the body is quite smart. It knows what it needs and it knows perhaps what it can't handle, and maybe I don't need every single detail from the most traumatic parts of my life. I understand what happens. I know that my body remembers, and I know enough to choose to be actively involved in my recovery every day. Um, and sort of swimming around in the pain of my trauma was a very favorite pastime of mine in my substance use disorder, and probably just as toxic as the substance itself. But so I do try and be aware of that and how susceptible I am to doing that.
Um, if you had the chance, unless there's no, just a curious question. If you had the opportunity for a do-over, would you would you conduct your recovery in any different way?
No, I don't think so. I had regrets in the beginning that I didn't go to rehab and that I couldn't afford to go to, some kind of posh rehab and I didn't have those resources and everything. But then I hear these terrible stories about these facilities and I think, wow, I really dodged a bullet. I do wish that I just had a greater understanding, of all of it, the way that it operates, from a clinical perspective, from a historical, like I just wish I had that up front. But it was a transformative journey to go and research all these things and come into each wave of understanding, I think at the right time, because I was, getting deeper and deeper in my recovery. I was really, thawing out. And so I think that those epiphanies landed right at the moment that I was able to hold them and put them into practice and make use of them. Um, Whereas before, maybe I would have had something and I could have made excuses for myself and thought, oh, it's not so bad. I'm fine, and then I might have gone, a couple more rounds. But I think it occurred just as it should have. It was serious, it was dire. And for me, yeah, like it was just, I crashed into the brick wall. There was no other path. I had to go through it. And I went to AA. And I do believe that the root of my substance use disorder was this pain, this generational pain that I was carrying, and also the life experiences that I had accumulated. Excuse me. And I was just pushing them down, and I had to allow them to rise, and I had to come into a full consciousness of them. And I had to, move through the process through cognitive behavioral therapy, through narrative therapy to speak about them. Like I say, I want my parents to understand substance use disorder, the reality of it, the facts. I had to speak about what happened to me, not in the stories that I'd been told or the mythology built around it, where I am at the center, the lowest person, the lowest piece of in the world. I had to speak about them in reality and facts. I had to acknowledge those facts, so that I could be liberated of the shame. And so that's how I rebuilt myself, through the simple stating of the facts and to own my story. That was something that I had never done, as wild as that may sound at my age and at my stage in life in my 30s. That was the first time for me, and it was something that felt so degrading, as to identify as an addict. Oh my God, I was going to hide my head. I was never going to be seen in public that way. I was never going to let anyone know, particularly when I came into an understanding of the reality, the facts behind my sexual assault. I truly believe that I couldn't be a survivor and embrace that identity and also identify as an addict, because I thought, well, I can be a survivor, and that's the truth. And the truth is, I am also an addict. But if I identify as both, I'll never be believed. I'll be totally discredited. Who's going to believe an addict? So um, yeah, there were a lot of stories like that I did internalize, that I had to dismantle, that I had to totally tear down to get to back to a point, like you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, where I was struggling to write with a pencil like the other kids. I was struggling to keep up, and we just kind of hurried past it and swept it under the rug. And but that little root that remained, and it went straight to the bottom, and then all the others piled on top of it, and we ultimately had a pretty toxic cocktail, sort of
Yeah.
a bomb that erupted. But I was lucky enough to survive it and to recover.
Um, w Let me wrap up, I guess, but, we could I think we could probably go on for another time. We could probably do a whole bunch of shows.
Yeah, drink to
We're
his face.
we could start on the next book. Um,
Yes, yes. From your lips, Bill, there will be a second book.
have you have you had any people come after you? If so, let me at 'em, but have you had any people come after you negatively about this book?
Not yet. And I did write an article that sort of was the beginning of this book in 2020. And there was some backlash, but they it was just miraculous that the overwhelming sentiment was of support and gratitude, and just sort of saying, "Thank you. I've been feeling this, and I needed to put language to this," or "I never knew the history of Kenton Lake. I never knew the indigenous origins of recovery." Um, and that really kept me rooted in what one of my friends, and a person that I think of as a spiritual leader to me, um, said, "This isn't about you. This book isn't about you." And I thought to myself, wow, I mean, it is a memoir, so it is about me. But just that, the assignment is to use my story to contextualize topics that many might perceive as more complex or conceptual, and to understand how those things are deeply, intimately embedded in our lives, and how we can bring some awareness to them, so that we can engage in our recovery from a practice of liberation, and we can think of ourselves as connected not only to each other, but to the world, to the earth, to people all over. Um, and my partner is Nawa Pipil, which is an indigenous peoples from El Salvador, and we went in August before to sort of get grounded and just focus on the purpose of the book. And we engaged in ceremony on International Indigenous Peoples Day, and I was giving their loving support and protection. And so I think that is probably, I believe in their protection, and that I definitely agreed that I would do everything to protect the purpose, and to engage in this not as an individual and I want to be seen as a literary author. I want XYZ from my career, but because I want this to be part of a healing conversation for us all. And I believe in that, in the essence. So in in the now practice, you pray not to just the four corners, the elements of the earth that keep us all together and alive and prospering and well, but to the root of the essence, to the heart of the essence. So you pray to the heart of the essence. So you say, gracias al corazón del agua, gracias al corazón del cielo, gracias al corazón del cielo, de la tierra, y gracias al corazón del aire. And so you pray to the four elements. And I feel like I confused that for a moment, but my point is that you think about not just these things as, yeah, oh, it's the sky, it's the land, it's the air, it's the water, but you think about them as alive, as sentient, just as we are. You think about the essence, the heart of the essence of them. And that really keeps me grounded. I think about even the heart of the essence of this book and its mission and the heart of your essence, which is so, luminous and warm and loving, And I think, wow, it's so meant to be that we're here together. And I know that through your platform, that this is going to reach, many, many more people. And so it is, as they say, right? And
Well,
so it is.
and if they're smart, they'll go out and buy the book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. It's
So
been so wonderful.
you've been listening to Jessica Hoppe talk about her new memoir, First in the Family, a story of survival, recovery, and the American dream. Thank you for joining us, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Bill. I hope to be back. Book 2.
Okay. Be
Okay.
sure to join us next month for another edition of the Kingfisher Project right here on Radio Catskill.